Please take a seat. Don't rush. It's okay. We're only just getting started. Apologies. We're a couple of minutes later than planned starting, but the welcome is as warm as ever. My name's Owen Roberts. I'm Director of Collections and Digital Services here at the library, and I'm very glad to see all of you here in the drum tonight, and a very warm welcome as well to those who are joining us online. Now we have a very topical subject for the 31st of October this year. We're delighted to welcome Phil Carradice to the library for a special talk on witches, witchcraft and witch hunts. The talk, I believe, was going to span a couple of thousand years. Please feel free to take a seat as I present. We're going to span a couple of thousand years, possibly, and we're going to focus maybe on a particular period between the 1400s and the 1750. Yeah. Phil is a historian and a writer who's written extensively on Welsh history. He has over 60 books to his credit, including one which has inspired today's talk, Witches and Witch Hunts Through the Ages. Now, on your way in, the books are there, and they are available to buy outside on your way out. So Phil will be checking, I'm sure. Phil's also broadcast extensively on BBC Radio, Radio 3, Radio 4, and he also had his own series on BBC Radio Wales, The Past Master, which was looking back at figures through and moments through history. And with that much of an introduction, I will hand over to Phil. Please give him a very warm welcome.
Golly, if you can clap like that at the end, it'd be much better. Thank you very much for the introduction. Yeah, golly, programmes on Radio Wales. I used to come up here and do research as well when I did my PhD many moons ago. So I know the library reasonably well. The books are available, but my son, my youngest son, who's never said a decent word about anything I've ever written until this book came out, and he said, "Dad, your new book, it is absolutely fantastic." I said, "Really, Doug?" He said, "Yeah, the lead keeps falling out the back of my computer, and if I can shove it in." I would have clipped him, but he's bigger than me now. Right, apologies again for state of hair. The reason being, I've been doing a television series for an Australian television company all about Hitler and his women. I wrote that as well, but that's beside the point. And they filmed it over a period of 6 weeks, and they said, "Do not cut your hair. Leave it as it is." And then when they stopped, they said, "Do not cut your hair because we're coming back for a new series in the new year." The last time I had hair like this, I was in the 1960s. You know, remember those days? Right. Witches and witchcraft and witch hunts. If you don't mind, I'm going to start because, as you heard, I am a poet, a novelist, a biographer, a historian. So I thought I'd just read. Have you come across flash fiction? Yeah. You know, no? Flash fiction is stories told in the fewest possible words. The classic short story in flash fiction is by Ernest Hemingway, who said, "For sale, child's cot, never used." Says it all, doesn't it? I wish I'd be that clever. But this is one for this booklet, and it's called Fire. It was warm, and to begin with, comforting. After the hosing, the water, and the cold, she welcomed its embrace. It was only as the flames began to lick at the hem of her dress and the agony began to scorch and sear at her legs that she finally realised what it all meant. And then she closed her eyes and screamed as the crowd began to chant, "Witch, witch. That's a story on its own. I read it for a reason. Because 90% of the women, we'll talk about this in a minute, 90% of the women who were executed in the Middle Ages didn't have the faintest clue of what's happening to them. They didn't understand. And we'll come back to that in a minute. Witchcraft. I don't know about you, but I don't know how your ancient history is, but Homo sapiens emerged, shall we say, some 2 million years ago. Now, it took some time for them to understand their world and to wander out, to find their legs and wander out. It took many thousands of years. So it was only really 70,000 BCE. Or, you've got to say that now, don't you? Okay, you can't say AD, and they've changed it all. So 70,000 years to 80,000 years that they began to foray out to find what the big wide world was all about. And as they went, they encountered all sorts of problems. They encountered tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. Bear in mind, the earth was still forming. And they didn't have a clue as to what was happening and why it was happening. They had to find a reason. And some people, no names, no pactorial, they decided that it was the forces of evil that were creating these explosions, these deadly, deadly events. And of course, what that led to was people trying to find names for the people who are causing all of these problems. And bear in mind, we're talking now in the Neolithic period, Neolithic and Paleolithic period. They were both of them, non-literary periods. In other words, they did not have the ability to read, write. But what they did have were cave paintings. And if you've ever been to Egypt, or you've been to the south of France or the north part of France, they've got wonderful cave paintings. And that's where we first encounter witches. Witches in the same breath as ghouls and ghosts and spooks, all of these evil creatures that were blamed for the misapprehension, for the mistakes of the world. Now, when you think about it, there's a lot of common sense. I'm going to read you a little few pages out of this brilliant book. Despite what my dear son says. And listen to this. This to me sums up really what the people thought about it. If I can find the place. Okay. A small band of storytellers began to talk together about what was facing their comrades. And there really was a huge gulf between the storytellers, who became, if you like, the priests. They really were the intelligentsia. And if you consider it, it's people would sit and they would display happiness because the food was plentiful. There were animals to hunt. The cave was warm. They had fire. But then suddenly they began to think, these storytellers, what would happen if suddenly this was all to disappear? What would then happen? And what you got then was this terror, this real terror, because the one word that in witchcraft is, I'm not criticizing, but the one word that keeps coming to and fro is terror. Because I don't know about you, but I can remember I was born and brought up in Pembrokeshire, a country farmhouse, and my aunt, aged aunt who lived next door, would every winter come along and sit in front of our roaring, crackling fire. and she would tell us stories about ghosts and ghouls and vampires and witches. And I used to love these stories. And that, if you like, was gone. We don't have that anymore much longer. Nowadays, kids go straight onto the computer, don't they? But that's where it all continued. So, let's just think about some of these stories. You're very expectant, you're very quiet. I used to teach heavy-end delinquent kids. My first class of children, they were 13 years old, 5 in the class. Many teachers in the room? Yes, 5 in the class, wouldn't be bad with it. Trouble was, 2 were murderers, 2 were armed robbers, and 1 was a rapist. So, holding them, keeping them interested, and I was meant to be teaching them history. First thing I taught them was about witches, and lots of these stories come from there. If we say that witchcraft surfaced in this Paleolithic period mainly, then realistically it was welcomed by the people. And it was in Mesopotamia, currently Libya, where so much of this was founded. And they had, for the first time, they introduced pebbles carved in the image of a dead person. And they put it outside his door. That's where we got the idea, well, modern society got the idea of the headstones from. They had other things to ward off the witches, because the witches were happy to come along and steal a soul, to take somebody from life into death and up through the perilous paths to the new, brand new heaven. They didn't call it heaven; they called it the afterlife. So if they could stop people stealing their bodies, they were happy. If you had what people had to do, different generations, different societies in Mesopotamia, they had goat ghosts. Heard of goat ghosts? Goats dressed up as the person who's just died. And the idea being that the visiting witch would mistake the goat for the dead person. Believe me, that's what it was supposed to do. As society developed, Egypt, Rome, they became absolutely fascinated by the spiritual world. And in a way, that's where we get this idea of spectral evidence. If you look at how many of you have ever sat and read or seen The Crucible by Arthur Miller? Yeah, brilliant play. The people get condemned, and it's based on the Salem witch trials. An account of witches in there. But an account of the witch trials, if you look at them, 40 people accused, 30 in jail, 19 executed. All on what we call spectral evidence. In other words, no firm evidence at all. Spectral, it was the gods. So if I didn't like you, I could say, you're a witch. The next minute, you're accused and you are arrested. And you feel unlucky, you get condemned as well. Stay right to the end, that stayed. But the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, they became really, really fascinated by this spectral evidence. And if you look at Rome, of course, became absolutely besotted. What they liked was the idea of, you want to ask an evidence, and you want to make sure that you are embarking on a good life. Ask the oracle. You want to go to war, to win the war? Ask the oracle. Absolutely fascinated by it. But of course, the real power behind witchcraft, it was seen as an alternative to religion. But it began to go wrong for the witches with the birth of Christianity. The birth of Christ took about 100 years for Christianity to find itself and form itself. And by the end of that 100 years, witchcraft was resigned as being the evil side of things. And that's where we come into our story really begins. Because the Middle Ages, and we take that period, 1000, not 1066, but 1000, through to 1750. Period of what, 700 years? That's the really fascinating side of witch hunting. And witch hunting became a pastime. It became a profession. Because suddenly witchcraft was seen as a combat, a challenge to Christianity in particular. And the number of people who were accused of being witches in those early days was astronomical. Between 1400 and 1750, believe it or not, 80,000 people were accused of witchcraft. 80,000. Of those 80,000, 70,000 were executed when found guilty on spectral evidence. No evidence at all, in other words. Think about Arthur Miller's Crucible. I call you a witch, therefore you're a witch. And because of that, 70,000 were actually executed. Now, it's interesting to think, we're talking now about the whole of Europe. Switzerland, particularly virulent. The Germanic states, because it wasn't Germany as such, very virulent. But then you look at the British Isles. In the British Isles, it was not considered to be a crime. Witchcraft was a religious problem until good old Henry VIII. God, he's guilty of so much stuff, isn't he, Henry VIII? But he made it a criminal offence. And suddenly, we have an upsurge in the number of people who were being executed or being charged. And again, this spectral evidence business, you're a witch, therefore you're arrested. We'll look at why in a minute. But what happened was that in England, 2,000 to 3,000 people in that period were arrested, were condemned, and were burned at the stake, or, as in England, hanged. Scotland, 4,500, all burned at the stake. Ireland, we haven't got a clue. They didn't reply. Anybody know? Wales, 5. Just 5. It's 5 too many, but 5. Because you see what happened. We'll look at why. Bear in mind that we are talking spectral evidence here. And we are talking people accusing a woman, because of those 70,000 that were burned, 90% were women. And you've got to ask yourself, why? Why should that huge number be women? And the answer is, what we had was a change in demographic makeup. Women were starting to get married later in life, if they married at all. Women were vulnerable because of that. They reckon at one stage, 50%, nearly 50%, of the female population of Britain was, frightened me, 50% accused. So why? Why did they accuse women? Well, if you were a woman without support, your husband had died, or you'd never had a husband, and with this business of spectral evidence, I fancy your land. I like the idea of that farmhouse you're living in. I like all those cattle you've got. You're a witch. Misogyny. It was absolutely clear. And it was run because of a man called Heinrich Kramer. Listen to this. This isn't me. This is Heinrich Kramer. It's from his book, Malleus Magnificarum. It's like the Witchfinder's Bible. Sorry, ladies, but this is what he wrote. Women are intellectually like children. The natural reason is that she was more carnal than a man. It should be noted that there was a defect in the formation of the first woman, since she was formed from the bent rib, that is, a rib from the breast, which was bent, and it were in a solitary direction. Since, although the defect is of an imperfect being, women are always deceivers. For Cato said, when a woman weeps, she weeps snares. And again, when a woman weeps, she labours to deceive a man. If you want to throw things at me, Phil, now's the time. It wasn't me. That was Kramer. But you can see the attitude that was around in the Middle Ages. Men went to the pub for a pint. Women, when they gathered together, was usually around the village pump. And they were accused of gossiping and deceiving and planning and plotting. Hence what we get. Numerous 70,000 burned at the stake. And when you say burned at the stake, there are two ways of burning at the stake. In Scotland, they put a ladder up against the fire. And as the flames burned the bottom of the ladder, so the ladder fell into the flames. The French, they laid the ladder on the floor, strapped someone to it, pushed it into the base of the flames. You imagine that? Horrendous. Absolutely. And it was very much a family day out. Let's go to the burning. Joke not. That was the attitude. Really frightened the living daylights out of me. So, when people started to realise there was money to be made out of this witchcraft business, they increased it again and again and again. And of course, some people realised that there were times and opportunities for what we now know as witch hunters. And the famous one, of course, is the Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins. Hopkins, born, bred, raised, operated in East Anglia. Didn't go anywhere else. Norfolk, Suffolk, all those areas. Cambridge, and that's where he operated. He was only a witch hunter for 2 years. And in 2 years, he condemned 200 women. Now, he was never, ever an officially appointed witch hunter. There was no such thing. He took it on himself to become a witch hunter because he would simply say, your town is full of witches. Leave it up to me, I'll get rid of them for you. It will cost you. He made himself a small fortune. Literally a small fortune. But only 2 years. His friend, who did it with him, lasted another year, another 12 months. And there were some horrible, horrible stories about what went on. But he was never an officially appointed witch finder. It's all down, 90% of what people think is down to that incredible man, the actor. I always tend to say Christopher, what's his name, but it's not. It's, and we know who played the part in Witchfinder General? Sorry? Vincent Price. I tell you, I've got a problem with my eye. I'm losing my sight. And I'm going to the hospital every month to have injections into the eyeball. Macular degeneration. And every time they put the mask on me to go into me, and they say, keep your eye open, because you can't close it. I just got this impression of Vincent Price coming at me with a dirty, great big needle, you know. That's what he did, you know. So it's that made Matthew Hopkins so famous. Hopkins is also famous for the ways that he found out witches. He did it two ways. One, and I'm sure you've heard of this before, the water torture, where they drop you in the water, you drown, you're innocent. You survive, you're guilty. Take you to the gallows. But what they don't tell you is that they tied the left big thumb to the right big toe. The right big thumb to the left big toe. So the woman was in a fetal position to begin with, bent double. There is no way on God's earth that she's going to survive being dropped into the water. The other method he used was witch pricking. It was believed, thanks because of Kramer in his book, that all witches had witch marks on their bodies. That could be either an extra nipple, or it could be a wart, or a burn, or a scar. Now, we're talking Middle Ages. I can't imagine anybody at that time not having marks on their body. And so, foregone conclusion. But what the witch prickers did, they had knives about that size. And it was a very sharp blade. They put it against the mark and jabbed. If no blood came out, you were a witch. If blood came out, you were innocent. So how did they stop it? Very simple. The knife blade, the blade itself, the minute they pushed it, it retracted into the handle. So what they got was, inevitably, a dead witch on their hands. These were the methods they used. It frightens the living daylights out of me, really. And you think about it, that some of the tortures that these women, and the odd man, they were unbelievable. Let's look at Welsh witches. Why were there only 5 women executed for witchcraft in Wales? Several reasons. One, the language. Bear in mind that 1536, Henry VIII, he keeps coming up, doesn't he? Henry VIII, basically Act of Union, all the rest of it. He outlawed Welsh as a formal language. If you wanted to get on in the law and whatever you were doing, you had to speak English. Most of the people in Wales were monoglot Welsh speakers. The people who were in charge, the judges, the examiners, they were English. They couldn't understand what these people were saying. And the people who were accused couldn't understand the judges. So there's one reason. Second reason, Wales was a hotbed of crime. Petty crime. Stealing, cows in particular. And the courts were full of criminals. But the big reason, and the most significant reason, was the women in Wales were known as wise women. And the wise women were, if you like, the doctors, the medicine hunters, the medicine purveyors. Mudvie, you heard of the physicians of Mudvie? On the border with Carmarthenshire here. That's the famous one. I did a radio program from there. And the woman who was running the place said to me, well, because what would happen, Phil, these women, these wise women, were necessary. They looked after you when you were ill, because there was no doctors. They looked after your animals when your animals were ill, because there were no vets. They were such a crucial, vitally important part of the economy. Bear in mind, Wales then was a very, very rural community. No cities, very few towns, no Cardiff, no Aberystwyth, small houses and small pieces. So they needed these women, and that's the reason that they were never, ever, ever prosecuted. When I did the programme from Myddfai, my usual self speaking about it all, and the woman who was hunting for herbs, she said, come on then, come and help me look for the herbs. So we went out and we looked into the hedgerows and we found herb after herb after herb. She took them back in and she crushed them up in a mortar and pestle, crushed them all up. And she added some liquid. Now, I don't know what liquid it was. I try not to think. Because urine was one way of getting rid of a witch. If you ever go to the St. Fagans Museum, you can see in there witch bottles with, I'm sure it's not urine, but it would have been witch bottle of urine that was to ward off the witches. So this woman mixed this up, God knows what it was, and she made me drink it. And I couldn't refuse because it was live on the radio. Greater love hath no BBC commentator. Oh. But it's, when you think about it, it is horrible. It's why, if we look at why Wales only had 5, Scotland with its 4,000, why? The answer to that is the king. James the 6th of Scotland, 1st of England. He was a demonologist. He became fascinated by witches. He wrote a book called Demonology. And how he became fascinated, he went to Denmark to pick up a wife. That's what you did in those days. A joke not, he decided he was going to go and find a wife. But when he married her and started to come back, a gale blew up. And his convoy, he had about 14 ships in the convoy, were not touched. His ship was blown onto the rocks. And he said, the devils are after me. The witches are after me. They tried to get back on 3 separate occasions. Failed every time. But what it did, of course, convinced James that there were witches. And he wrote this book, Demonology, which you can still get. If you're interested in witchcraft, have a read of it, because, again, it frightens the living daylights out of me. But that's the reason. There were so many reasons for this, for this propensity of witchcraft. The Welsh witches, though, let's just have a look. I had to make a note because my Welsh is very limited, coming from Pembroke. We don't have Welsh. Well, we didn't. It's starting to change now. Who were the 5? Well, the first one who got away with it, Tangloist Ferch Glyn, who was accused of having poppet dolls. You've seen poppet dolls? Pins? I'll tell you a story at the end in a minute about poppet dolls. And she was accused of fashioning a poppet doll that resembled the Bishop of St. David's. And she left the poppet doll with a pin inserted outside St. David's Cathedral. They both got away with it. He had made some unfortunate remarks. She got away with it. So the first one to actually be to be executed was Gwen Ferch Ellis. She's from Betws, and she was exposed as a witch, but she was a healer. She was a healer. And yet she could not defend herself. She was persuaded to leave, but she had done something stupid. She was persuaded by a friend, Jane Conway, to leave a curse outside the house of Thomas Montague, Lord Thomas Montague. She was found guilty. She was hanged. The second batch, 3 of them together, they were all members of the same family. The Welsh court, the court records here, if you want to have a look at them, they'll be there. These were, if you like, all part of, but they were all from North Wales. Roderick ap Even, Lowry Ferch Ellis, Agnes Ferch Evan. All 3, same family. accused of witchcraft. And that's something that happens. You get that very often. You may have heard of the Pendle witchcraft, the Pendle witch trials, England, not Wales. And that was a family, a whole family, who were accused of witchcraft. 9 or 10 in the family, all done, executed. But anyway, to go back to the Welsh ones, we had the 3, and the last one, 1655, Margaret Ferch Richard. She was on Anglesey, and Anglesey was already considered to be an area of great magic. It's where the Druids used to go. You know, the Druids who were the Welsh Druids who in 65, I think, they were executed by the Romans, who invaded and murdered them all. But Anglesey was always regarded as a haven for spiritual goings on. After as the Middle Ages proceeded, witchcraft did not go away. And more people were being accused of witchcraft. So that by 1800, we had over 100,000 people who had been accused of witchcraft. Of that 100,000, 80,000 were women. Nervous women who didn't know what was happening to them, didn't know what it was all about. Executed, burned, or hanged. Choice was down to the local government. But eventually, it was to, have you heard of the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment when, people began to realize that the Bible was not a literal piece of writing. It was, in fact, metaphysical, and it was metaphorical. So you could interpret it, and that's what they began to realize. And so they began to say, well, maybe this witchcraft thing, maybe it's not the answer. Because, let's be honest, if they say to you, look, you're a witch, do you want to survive? Yes. In that case, admit it. What are you going to do? I admit, I hold up my hand. And that's what was happening in those later days. But it's carried on. The last witch burned in Britain, 1755, up in Scotland. The Scots had they have a lot to answer for. My background is Scottish, so I can say that quite easily. I used to accuse my father of being a witch, because witches don't have to be women, okay? But if you think about it, 1650 to 1400, 1400 through to 1750, it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. And, of course, people made a fortune out of it. People frightened themselves to death. But after this last witch was actually executed, the British government made... the act, the Witchcraft Act, was still there, but it became a non-capital punishment offence. So they were imprisoned, and it wasn't, would you believe, until 1954 that the Witchcraft Act was finally taken off the statute books. I think witchcraft died out. Or at least the black magic art died out. People, the wickedest man in the world, who was if you ever go to the house in Newport, that's where his boss used to live, and there's still a witch room in that house. Cadw haven't done anything about it. Go and have a look at it before Cadw do decide that they're going to stop it. But witchcraft, Wicca, as it's now known, is still there, it's still powerful. But people aren't using it as an evil, as a deadly enterprise. They're using it for the good things that was originally intended for. Apart from in certain countries of this world, if you look about it, you think about it, Africa, Ghana last year executed 1,000 women for witchcraft. India, one state in India executed 800 people for witches. Just think the next time you fly off to Mexico to watch Elvis Presley jump off that big cliff. Mexico is probably the greatest witchcraft purveyor of the modern world. More people killed in Mexico for being a witch than any other country. What happened in the witch hunting, witch hunting became a fabulous game. You know, it was totally independent of government, but people jumped on the bandwagon. They wanted to have witch hunts, and it was brutal. And it was, once it began, it was a it was disastrous. It was horrendous. And it was the rougher element of the community that actually worked their wiles. But now, in this modern day and world we have different types of witch hunts. I'm sure you're all far too young to remember Senator Joseph McCarthy. Remember Senator Joe? Who accused people of being communists. And more important, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Right. Have you ever known anybody who has been a member of the Communist Party? That's the fatal, that's the blow. And you would get away with it by dubbing your mate in it. And between 1950 and 1954, hundreds of Americans were accused of being communists and were, in some cases, arrested. I mean, it was all to do with the Lavender Mob. The Lavender Mob, which people don't remember the Lavender Mob. That was when people in America said, we won't have any gay man or woman in our government employ because they are easily bribed, easily persuaded. And who was at the front of that, you know? Senator Joe. Makes you think, doesn't it? Be interesting to see what Mr. Trump says about it. But witchcraft is still alive out there. It's still there. In America, witchcraft or Wicca has been declared an acceptable religion. Some, usually with this, tied up with the churches, some of the more radical, some of the, from the southern states, they have said, we will offer bullying as a way of stopping people being badly behaved. And you were a son who's misbehaving, send him to one of these churches. And they beat the 11 bells of whatnot out of them. Makes you think, doesn't it? Still there. Witchcraft is still there. But hopefully, when you read this wonderful book, it will help make you think that witchcraft needs to be ironed out. But it's still there, and it's frightening. The hunt for witches. I mean, even in this country we have witch hunts. You remember Boris Johnson's aide, who drove his car 30 miles to Barnard Castle? Remember that? To test his eyesight? With his little baby in the back. He was witch hunted. There was such an uproar. I don't say he didn't deserve it, but it was a witch hunt. And we still have witch hunts like that. I'll finish, if I may, by reading you. One of these days I'm going to keep going when I bend like that. By reading you a story that's not too long. It's one element of witchcraft that I really still find fascinating. Let me give you a piece of advice. Never invite a vampire into your house. You see, vampires can't just storm in through your window, through your doors. Vampires have got to be asked in first. As long as you don't ask them to come in, you're quite safe. It was a dark, wet, windy night when Dad came home from work. He had someone with him. This, he declared, is Ivan. He's come to work with me at the factory. He needs lodgings. Mum says she doesn't mind. He's going to be stopping with us. Good evening, Ivan said in a thin, dry voice, with the faintest hint of an accent. I am pleased to be here. Ivan was a tall, thin man, and from the moment I first saw him on that cold winter evening, I knew that I didn't like him, not one bit. There was something about his eyes, something behind his eyes, I should say, that frightened the living daylights out of me. What's he doing here? I asked, when Mum, my sister's trailing in her wake, had taken Ivan upstairs to show him his room. Dad shrugged. Like I said, he's here in the factory with me. Mum's going to have him in as a lodger. The money will be very handy at Christmas. Over the next few weeks, we got to know Ivan. He was quiet and rarely spoke, or at least not to me, or to my father either, as far as I could see. My two sisters loved him, of course, right from the start. Sit here, Ivan, they would say, and quickly make room for him on the settee. Ivan would whisper, thank you, and settle himself down in front of the television set. I could only grimace and snarl to myself. After all, they never asked me to sit on the settee with them. It was only as the weeks went by that I began to realise something was seriously wrong. My sisters had grown pale and listless, not running about screaming and shouting like they usually did. Oh, they still doted on Ivan, but somehow they never seemed to laugh anymore. And it was the same with my mother. She had no energy, just sat in her chair all day long, staring out into space. Ivan, well, I never seemed to get to see him. Mum said he was up early, long before I got out of bed. But when I did see him in the evenings, it was clear he was thriving on my mother's food. As Mum and my two sisters grew paler and weaker, Ivan grew fatter and fitter. And so it went on, until one day I went into the school library at lunchtime and found a book all about witches and vampires. I read, and the more I read, the more it came to me. Ivan was a vampire, and he was feeding on my family. Well, it was logical. He did come from Romania. I've been to Romania. It's not Roman at all. I knew I had to do something quickly. And I knew I had to do it before Ivan was up and about. When the afternoon session finished, I went straight home. The house was quiet. My two sisters were still in their school. Dad was at work. Mum was taking a lie down on her bed. I went out into the garden shed and I started to work. First, I took one of Dad's fence posts and I sharpened it into a small, pointed stake. Then I took an old wooden hammer, a mallet, from the back of the shed and weighed it in my hand. Heavy, compact, ideal for what I had in mind. I went back indoors with my stake and my hammer. In the kitchen cupboard, I found a large clove of garlic and I hung it around my neck. I was ready. I went up the stairs towards Ivan's room. By now it was getting on for dusk. You know, the way the light begins to fade on winter evenings. Everything was grey and dim. If I was going to do this, I thought, I had to do it quickly before Ivan was up and about. I pushed open the door to his room. My heart, my breath, my blood, everything seemed to stand still inside me. I felt sick. The more I was more afraid than I'd ever been at any stage in my life. But I steeled myself, to move forward. I went slowly across the floor until I was looking down into Ivan's box. There he was, lying there, fat, handsome. I won't go into too much about what happened. Let me just say that when I placed the stake next to his heart, Ivan opened his eyes and glared at me. I smashed down with the hammer. Oh, the scream that Ivan gave would stay with me till the day I die, but I hit down again and again and again. At last, Ivan was dead. I fell back in relief. I turned to see my sisters ghosting in through the doorway. Behind them waited my mother. It's all right, I said. It's all right. It's all right. You're quite safe now. It's all over. All three of them stared at Ivan's body. Then their eyes swiveled around to glare at me. And I saw the long, sharp fangs at the corners of their mouths. Slowly, they began to move towards me. Like I said, take my advice. Never invite a vampire into your house, into your home. But then, in your case, it's already too late. Remember, you asked me to come here today. You invited me in. Not necessarily a witch story, but the witches, they're linked, because some of the famous witches became vampires or were vampires to start with. I probably droned on and bored you to death more than enough. Thank you for listening. If there are any questions, any queries, happy to take them. I'll also, if you're going to take £20 notes if you want. But anything at all. Abuse, I can take abuse. But abuse has to be written on a £20 note. Nobody?
I've got a question.
Right.
You might have said, but what got you into this in the first place? How did it all...
This,
how did it start?
quite simple. The publisher paid me. This is Pen and Sword. If any of you fancy writing a book, I would urge you to think about Pen and Sword. It's Gilly Cooper's husband who actually founded the company. He died, but the company's still going. They came to me one day and they said, Phil, we'd like to do a deal with you. We want to give you a 3-book deal. 1 will be a book that we choose. 2 will be a book that you choose. And 3 will be a book that we can debate and discuss. That was the publishers. That's what they wanted. I'd written bits and pieces about witches in various other history books of mine. So they said that. My choice was a gentleman with the name of Richard Cromwell. And they didn't know who I was talking about. Surely you mean Oliver? I said, no. Oliver's son, Richard, Tumble Down Dick, as he was called. That was my choice, and we negotiated the 3rd one, which I've just finished and sent to them, which is The Great Fire of London, as if there aren't enough books on the Great Fire of London. But anyway, those are the so that's long answer to your question. It's because the publisher. I mean, I think I'm at the stage now that I don't write anything unless a publisher asks me to. I'm very, very lucky. But again, you see, you've got to say how I started. I was telling somebody this the other day. I went up to work in Brentwood in Essex. And again, the murderers and the armed robbers and all this. And I would go home at night and my wife would say, oh, for goodness sake, you're driving me crackers. Get down there, sit down there and write about it. And I would sit and I would write. Inside of a month, I had a big stack of things this. I happened to mention to a friend of mine who was on the staff. He said, let me see them. So I took them in, threw them on his desk. Can I keep them? He said, do what you like with them. As far as I'm concerned, they're just things to get rid of stress and strain. Fine. He came into my office 3 weeks later, tossed a copy of Teachers, you know, the Times Educational Supplement on my desk and said, page 27. Page 27, The Hour of the Wolf by Phil Carradice. And he'd sent the story off. He chose the one they wanted to use. I took the check. But then the phone call came in and they said, would I write one every month? And I said, look, I don't need to do it. I've got about 150 of the bloody things. And so every week, every month, a story of mine appeared in the Times Ed. And then at the end of that period, I had a phone call from a publisher who said, we'd like to put your stories into a book. And that's how my first book was written. It's the biggest load of garbage you've ever... It's a book of... it's badly written, very badly written. It's full of too many adjectives, too many descriptive phrases. And so what I say to people now, the book is called The Hour of the Wolf. If you ever come across a copy in a second-hand bookshop, because it's out of print now, if you go to Hay on Wye, you'll find some. Do me a favour, buy it. It'll cost you about £2.50. I'll give you 10 quid for it. Because what I then do, I take it out to my garden, I rip off the cover. I like the cover because it's a beautiful picture of a wolf howling at the moon. It's just the inside I hate. So I light my garden incinerator and I burn it. And I'm sure you shouldn't be librarians talking about burning books, should you? But as I wrote the damn thing, I reckon I could. But in the home at the moment, I've got 850 copies of the cover, but not one copy of the book. Sorry, long answer. Sorry, the lady at the back. Yeah.
Have you got a favourite witch?
Yes, I have got a favourite witch. Baba Yaga, who is the Russian witch, who flies around the world on a saucer, a huge saucer, hitting naughty children on the head with a cane, and then finding other witches, and that's how we have the witch of the broomstick. You know, if you were a woman wanted to sell something, she had crops, or if she had pastry or whatever, she would put a broomstick outside her door. And so Baba Yaga does this, and then if the children are very naughty, she eats them. She's probably my favourite. But bear in mind that it wasn't just poor people who were accused of witchery. People, the wife of King John was accused. The wife of Edward IV was accused. And Anne Boleyn was accused. But bear in mind, Anne Boleyn was not accused of witchcraft until 60 years after she was dead. They didn't dare. Because they thought she's a witch, like she'd get me, and her husband. But 60 years afterwards, somebody came up with this idea that she had an extra tooth growing out. She had scars and marks everywhere. Extra finger. Yeah? Rubbish. Utter rubbish. Would Henry VIII, dirty old bugger that he was, have really married a woman who looked like that? And the answer is no, he flaming wouldn't. So, again, not real, but my favourite is Baba Yaga.
Yeah, I think for one, I think we've got 2 hands up, yeah?
Okay.
Wait for the microphone so those online can hear.
All those people you told us that got persecuted and killed and everything, would any of them like to have been thought, did any of them think they were witches but they wanted to keep it quiet, or were they all innocent people that just got picked on?
No, normally they were just innocent people who were picked on. The one who was different was a Scottish, Mary Aitken, who was accused of being a witch. And she said, yeah, I'm a witch. But do you know something? I can tell if somebody else is a witch. And if you take me into your witch-finding team, I will identify all the witches for you. So she became one of the witch hunters. And 2 years she was doing it. And then one of the examiners said, there's something wrong here. So he deliberately sought out her 6 most recent victims. He showered them, bathed them, put them in new clothes, and put them in front of Mary. And he said, now then, are these witches? And she said, nah, they're not witches. She'd already condemned them the week before as being witches, and she was exposed as a fraud. She was promptly burned at the stake. And there's one at the back, I think it's...
So I know that you mentioned that religion and witchcraft was sort of a separate thing.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if you mentioned this. Is there a defining point that happened? Because I know if you look back to, say, ancient Greece, and I know obviously religion wasn't a word for them, but if you look at like Medea, Circe, Hecate, obviously that was all part of what we would perceive as their religion. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to know at what point it became separate.
It's 100 years after the birth of Christ, after the assassination of Christ, if you want to say even more. And it was seen as a rival, because bear in mind it was in effect when it began, as you say, it was a religion. Witchcraft was the religion, but then once the Christianity came, it was overseen and out, and it was brutal. And it was. You think about the things. You mentioned my favourite, and one of my next favourites is Hecate. Hecate is, she appears in Macbeth. Sorry, I shouldn't say Macbeth, the Scottish play. She was an incredible woman as well. You look in the period 1200 to about 1400, it was the time of chivalry. We talked about Anne Boleyn just now. Anne Boleyn was accused of sleeping around. But you see, Anne had spent 13 years at the French court, and she had adopted French customs. When the French kiss, French kissing, remember, she put her tongue into the person's mouth. It was what they did. So, what's witchy? I have a read of Macbeth. When shall we three meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain, o'er the place upon the heath, there to meet with Macbeth. I come, grey milk, paddock calls, fair is foul, and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Phil, for a fascinating talk and for taking those questions at the end. Our time has run out, unfortunately. Just draw your attention to the next events that we have coming up in the programme. They're all available to see on the library.wales website /events. We have a transcribe-a-thon coming up on the 5th of November. That's happening online as well. Nightshade Mother in conversation with Gwyneth Lewis then will follow on the 21st of November.
Gwyneth, and yes, very fine poet.
Indeed. We're very, very honoured to have her in that event. And yes, Christmas is around the corner. Our Christmas fair is going to be on the 5th of December, 4th of December, between 5 and 7 in this building. So there'll be a warm welcome that will soon be upon us. But can I just thank you all for your attendance here today, and to those of you who have joined us online as well. Therefore, have a great evening, and thank you very much for your attendance. Diolch yn fawr.